Thank you, thank you, thank you. We're going to change it up a little bit. Yes, I'm going to be meandering around this. Hopefully the feedback doesn't get too bad. I just hot spots, Mark. I'm going to try to avoid the hot spots. But what we're going to do is I'll do a quick introductions, and then I'll also explain how this format's going to be. So we're going to try to eliminate the repetition. You've heard a lot already this morning. We had great discussions around attachments, the rules, and all that. So we're going to kind of breeze through some of those things so you're not hearing it for the fifth time, right? But we will try to point out certain aspects that we haven't heard so far, but we're also going to make it interactive. Instead of waiting to the end for Q&A, we will actually allow you to ask questions as we proceed. Does that sound fair? Does that sound fun? Not so much, right? For those that are awake, yes. For those that are awake, no, Kev, please don't call on me. All right, so again, my name is Kevin Day. I'm a principal business advisor at Edifecs along with Mike Patwell. So he and I are peers at Edifecs. My primary responsibility within Edifecs is on the Da Vinci side and interoperability in terms of regulations, as well as participation with Mark and other astute people in the industry when it comes to Da Vinci work groups and so forth and so on. Been with Edifecs for about 18 years or so. Been in the healthcare industry for about 25. So I predate like everybody, like most people in the room. By show of hand, who predates 4010? Predates 4010. All right. All right. All right. UB 92s and all the CMS 1500s. Oh yeah, I remember those days. So Sergiu, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Sergiu Rata. I'm a VP of Product Management here at Edifecs. It's a fancy way of saying that I'm in charge of product, especially as it relates to transaction processing, which happens to include attachments, authorizations, that kind of stuff. So we are going to talk about what are the challenges, but a little bit of the spin. What are the different rules out there? I think we hope we're going to spend a little bit of time here. Actually, there is going to be some discussion. What is a possible solution, and of course something good. So let's start with the attachments. So what are attachments? Well, I think it's a simple question. Why do we even have this slide here? But I want to step back a little bit. What we believe in is we have to look at this holistically, the full journey of the patient. So it's not just claims, not just prior authorization, it's the full life cycle of the care. So if you rethink or re-look at from this perspective, then what is an attachment? Okay, it's something in support of a service or a payment, but in support of which use cases? People usually think, oh, attachment is just prior authorization or claims. No. Yes, prior authorizations and claims, but also includes things such as quality measurement, care coordination, those kind of things. Yeah, we have to actually expand what does it mean, attachment. It means a lot more than what people usually think, and that's how our vision actually is to solve this problem, not just a narrow thing. I mean, it is a problem right now in the industry in these areas, but we believe actually the problem is much wider. And of course, attachments and carry not only your PDFs, your images, but maybe lab results. Maybe it carries, forms, questionnaires, all kind of different stuff, clinical information. What are the current challenges? Well, we all know it's manual methods today, mostly. I mean, faxes, portals. I mean, portals is semi-electronic, but it's still a lot of manual. And another big challenge today, of course, is the proprietary methods. There is no standard still. People are dabbling in different ways of to exchange these attachments. And if we expand the notion of attachment is, then of course, yeah, some people are doing 275 transactions, some people are doing portals. Fax is still there, of course. Some people are doing direct getting into EMR and pulling that information. To me, that's another way of getting that attachment. So there's just a plethora of things how people are actually doing it, and of course that results in first of all huge administrative work on all the sides, on both sides of the equation. The fact that the attachment is so many things and in so many structured and so on, this leads to data quality. how much data do I get? What kind of data do I get? Do I get the right data? And then because of, especially on the payer side, they're getting so much data sometimes, because the providers are just fed up. Here, have fun, reading all these 100 pages. This may lead to some sense to, patient safety risk. And at the end of the day, there's very poor user experience. And I'm saying user experience is member experience at the end of the day. So here is just an example. I think you're all very well aware. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, how things are done today. Essentially it's faxes, phones, portals, both in the unsolicited and solicited case. I think you've seen this many times. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. And no wonder this leads to high cost. This is the data from CDEX core. Of course, CDEX core defines attachments as just, in support of prior authorization and claims. If we were to expand the definition, I would bet that the numbers will be much higher. So we are not even counting the magnitude of the problem. That's what I'm trying to say here. And the numbers below, what are the potential savings for providers and payers? I think it's much higher. Because, again, if we were to expand the definition, go beyond the claims and prior authorizations, I think there's way more room to improve it. And at the end of the day, yes, we were talking about, the payers, providers, they all have costs and whatnot. But again, coming back to our belief, why we waking up every day in the morning? Why we even look at this problem? To me, this is about solving the patient problem at the end of the day. Who suffers the most of it? So the lack of automation today leads to barriers of care. I mean, we all heard this horror stories about the prior authorizations, how long it takes to adjudicate, and so on. Of course, the big part of that is the lack of medical documentation. This leads to delays. At the end of the day, from a purely patient perspective, he doesn't care about all this admin stuff. He cares that his care gets delayed for God knows what reason. I think we've all been there. And the lack of good quality information leads to compromised care coordination. I think that's as simple as that. So bear in mind with that when we talk about attachment. Don't lose sight of the patient. Don't lose sight of the member. So no wonder, with all these problems, now we have a whole plethora of regulations coming up. Something needs to be done. That's absolutely clear. The other problem with the attachments is, of course, the lack of electronic attachments. If you look at today, it's just 8% of adoption. It's still very low. People are trying. They're trying hard to automate this, but 8%, come on. It's 2023. We are sending shit to the moon, and we still cannot solve this problem. It is a so yes, everyone here in the room, I think there is a consensus that something needs to happen, something needs to be done. We need to do something. So with that, I would turn over to Kevin. He was going to walk us through what is the regulatory landscape as it relates to this.
Thanks for the overly warm handoff, Sergiu. You can laugh at that, definitely. So, question. Who in the room, this is audience participation, happened to find an envelope with a $100 Amex card in it taped to the bottom of their chair? Did anyone happen to find that? Okay, that's good. I got 5 on that. that was an inside joke to myself. You can't laugh at yourself, laugh with yourself, right? So we'll kind of go through all that. Interesting question. He talked about the 8% adoption rate. No one's surprised by that, right? So in our little breakout sessions, I think we all sort of, at least definitely on the payer side and the vendor side, we kind of talked about that. Does anyone remember, can anyone volunteer, what do they think one of the number one challenge, a reason behind that low adoption? Anybody? I will call on people. What's that? Lack of a mandate's an option. Okay, let's get two. Let's get a second one. Lack of a mandate. And what's the, Joe? Complexity. Give me one, not an and. Complexity? Complexity to implement. Okay. So by a show of hands, because we're going to take an informal poll here, who thinks it is primarily due to lack of regulation? Lack of regulation. All right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 6 or 7. Now, how about complexity to implement? Show of hands. Derwin, as usual, is double dipping. All right. It's Chicago. Exactly. Can I buy your vote? We are in Chicago. All right. So I think it's always interesting to see about that. I've actually been involved with a blue in the Northeast to implement all this. And all the challenges that I heard from the payer community, from the vendor side, and definitely on the provider side, was absolutely the case. From the complexity to map to LOINC codes, right? Especially when it comes to proprietary codes in their adjudication system, reason codes, right? For pens and things like that. Definitely a challenge. The other thing, one of the benefits I had by going through that effort was I had the chance to go and sit down with a couple of the directors at this plan and interview 8 of their providers. We went to participate in this a little trial, if you would. It was a 6-month trial. And the number one, back to Sergio's point that we're trying to raise here, the number one complaint of the provider was saying, you know what, I've heard this before. Plans come to us and they pitch us the new widget, right? The new thing that's going to save them all kinds of money. But the one thing they said was, whatever this is, please, 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 if I'm going to give you this wealth of clinical information, can you stop having your office call me for the same bloody information for a different thing? Because if you're calling about it because I got a prior authorization, then the claim goes through. What happens if the claim still gets pended? It still happens. Even though there's a prior authorization, it may still get pended. Now we may be asking for similar information from the same provider, and a lot of times in the case it's the same information. And then I'm getting into HEDIS and STAR and gaps in care, or I've got to do chart pulls, and that's really where the I think, as an individual, not Edifecs, where the burden on the provider really comes into play heaviest, is the amount of information that plans ask of the providers, provide them for a set of business processes that are all valid, right? But there's inefficiencies on the plan side of utilizing. That's kind of what Sergiu was talking about. Hey, when we're just talk about holistically, right? Not just a technology of be it FHIR or CDEX or X12 and getting this information, but when you do get it in, index it, understand it, and then share it amongst your own internal process so you know what you do have. So you're not reaching out and asking for things you already have and you don't need. You've already asked for it already. Things like that. Hopefully that makes sense. In terms of regulations, I think we've all learned this. Interesting enough, I love the timeline on the 0053. Does anyone know how long it took from inception to actually last December when that NPRM came out? Anyone want to guess the number of years? Mark? 7. Mark from inception is to December is, he's saying 7. Anyone want to? More like 17, right? 2005. Right. Just saying that regulations, although we want them because then it forces us, on the plan side, right, to follow them. It's like, all right, boss, I got to do this and I need X number of millions of dollars because the federal government's telling me to do that, right? So it's like, I don't give a mother may I type of thing. It's like, no, dad told me I had to, right? So good, it came out, and it came out the same time as 57, but we discussed, right, with the letter, the big letter that came out. Now, I made the comment in the vendor side, in our room, that I personally felt that letter was very eye-opening to me because it was very unique. That's the first time in the 20 years I've been doing this stuff, regulations, I've seen a letter like that you had both the, let's say, lobbyists, right? The organization, the predominant organization representing providers and payers all saying the same thing about a regulation. That's so rare. right? But it did come out, right? Now, when it comes to the attachment mandate, for those that are into, Comic-Con and, and dressing up and all that, maybe this is for you, I don't know. But to the bottom left is Weedy, that's DAQH, and that's Da Vinci FHIR. Those are our little super people, right, representing those organizations. In terms of the 53 attachment mandate, of course, we've already been down this path ad nauseum on what it's about in terms of prior authorization. It's also dealing with claims attachment, but it doesn't go beyond that. Remember about that holistic approach, right? We want to reduce the burden on the provider by not asking for the same information. And that's kind of where the value-based care and risk adjustment, quality sharing, gaps in care, all that fun stuff comes into play, is saying, hey, you don't want to, when you're looking for a strategy, just don't go mandate driven is our message, right? Just don't think solely about the mandate, okay? Take the other types of value you can get out of an infrastructure to support all of them. Go ahead, advance for me. That's the eye test. Anyone want to point out to me what the letter, based on the letter, what would fall out of that? Anybody? So what you're seeing on the screen, what would I highlight to say the letter is saying don't do that? Pull that out of 53. The question makes sense. Doesn't the voice in my head? What do you think?
I don't know.
You see them cool. You can't. It's an eye test. So if those who can't really see it, not following online, it's the top left. So that's the prior auth portion. So all those little interchanges, right, which is all the prior auth, that's really what the letter is saying. It's saying, hey, we recommend that CMS consider retracting that portion, those aspects of the 53 requirements, right, which is really around the prior auth sequencing from the 278 request response, and really the response being a request for additional information, of which the 275 would naturally come back. Makes sense? That's what they're saying, pulling it out. So that's where the overlap turns into the 57 that we've been discussing about, right? And the conflict that they're going to cause in the industry. Okay, go ahead to the next one. This one's got questions or comments. I'm open to opinions being expressed as well. No bad opinions, just bad comments from Kevin. 57P attachment mandate, sorta. We refer to it as the burden reduction, but the thing about that one, of course, is that they explicitly spell out that they recommend specific APIs, right, in support of these functions around prior authorization being DTR, PASS, and of course CRD, right? But the DTR in the past, we focused on one reason why that's highlighted is that's where I'd say overlap, I guess, from a functional capability standpoint. That's really what CDEX implementation guide within the Da Vinci organization that, of course, we're one of the founders of, addresses specifically, right? It's about to provide a API-based means to do querying or questioning to the provider of here's clinical information I need for whatever business reason. That's the beauty of the Think the CDEX is that it's not tied to a specific business process function. Where some of the X12 stuff is very, very process oriented, right? It's claims that's pended, or it's a service prior authorization request or whatever. Where a general approach to exchange of ask of information for clinical information for business reasons via CDEX becomes a very interesting thing. Very interesting. I think organizations need to consider. Go ahead. All right. I'm going to turn it over to the sales rep. Our product guy. Tell you about solutions.
Thank you, Kevin. All right, so like I would say, solution. I understand it's a big burden to implement two things. And if it happens that we'll have to implement two things, so be it. But what I'm trying to say is we still have, I want to highlight again my idea that we have to consider the whole person and the needs of the whole person in the full spectrum of the needs. So that's why if you were to still, support both rules 57 and 53, then I would say, the 53P then can be used to, 275 transaction can be used definitely for exchange, in support of claims information. For those who, and here's the overlap. On the prior authorization side, of course, we also would have to support it. But 57P would give the provider a much better way of determining what information is really needed. So I think it's a kind of step in the right direction to actually make it way more specific. So because at the end of the day, what's the difference between 53P and 57P? Yeah, there is X12 FHIR, but again, business. Let's abstract on technology for a second. 57P essentially tells the provider, I need this specific information, not just give me the charge summary with a 100-page document and I'm going to try to sift through. Give me this specific element. So it's very kind of more specific. It tells also reduce burden on the provider side because now they know, oh, this is what exactly I need to submit to the payer. They have a much higher confidence that this thing will go through. And this is kind of what is lacking on the 53P side. It's less, in my mind, it's a less specific. It's just still the mindset of from 2016 when this thing started. But still, in my mind, is even if you were supporting 53P today, if everybody in the country would have supported by now the 53P, I think we would have been in a much better state anyway. We would have saved money. We would have made the life for the patient better. Of course, we should not stop. We should move beyond. We should go to higher automation, higher savings, which would lead inevitably to higher outcomes for the patient. That's where the Da Vinci CDEX that Kevin was mentioning is coming into play. This IG actually allows the payer to ask and get the information from the provider in the support of all other use cases, which were not mentioned in the 53P, beyond the claims and prior authorization.
So I will say this, one thing I failed to, and should have, and I know Mark would correct me, right, is that one of the things to Sergiu's point on the specificity is the beauty of, I think, of what ONC is doing, right, is that they're going to push the EMR community, the provider community, in essence, the EMR vendors, right, for their certification requirements in order to support a very specific set of data sets, right? Now, it may be social determinants of health driven, which is probably one of the primary causes of it, but it's not solely. There's a lot of expansion. The beauty of that is now we can sit there and say, hey, if we, the community, mainly the providers and the payers, can agree to that US core data set nomenclature and specification, then we have a common terminology and structures of which we can then communicate, right, in an interoperable fashion, right, to gain efficiencies for these use cases we're talking about. That make sense? Okay.
So in terms of the capabilities, these are the things that payers would need to support if we were, both rules would come into play. So again, if you see, this covers the potential solution that payers would need to adopt would cover the whole gamut, not just prioritizations and claims, but beyond that as well. Of course, there is support for specific transaction set, 275, 278, 277 RFI, specific versions, 6020 and so on. And 6020 is just the proposed. Who knows what is going to be in the final rule? Maybe it's going to be 8010 or 80. But the thing is, the payers would need to support all these different transaction sets. From operational perspective, that's not enough. The solution would need to give you visibility into what's going on, really, behind the scene. How many outstanding requests are there? Are providers responding to this request? Who are the problem children? What do I do about it? What kind of outreach I can do? So the solution should be more comprehensive in our mind. And obviously, the solution should also provide deep integration into various systems. Like Kevin mentioned, yeah, it has to go, this attachment may, in support of, let's say, claim, I need to maybe push it to my document management system or imaging system, whatever I use, to store these attachments. But in addition to that, I probably also need to store it in some central place, like, maybe clinical data warehouse or FHIR server or whatnot. It doesn't matter what it is, but it has to be a central place where other use cases, other needs to tap into so that I can achieve reuse. I don't ask the provider again and again for the same information. and I can actually use that information in support for other use cases. So if I asked for this information, let's say, and I got that this patient has a clinical condition as part of my claim processing, well, maybe that I can use the clinical condition as part of my risk adjustment or some other use case.
So two things. One is, remember that 8% adoption rate? If you look at the black, the highlighted, maybe that's part of the reason for the low, just the magnitude of complexities I think plans in general are having to deal with. There's a lot. There's a lot there. Another poll question, specifically for the plans. So by a show of hands, when it comes to interoperability specifically, what part of the organization does it fall under? And your two questions are standard IT, or does it fall in like informatics department? Does that make sense? Like those that are dealing with HEDIS and all that. Because I'm kind of curious where on the plan, where ownership of interoperability is coming into play. And the reason why that kind of question is, the point we're trying to raise is that what I have seen, over the last probably 5 years of dealing with this, and with probably talking with like 60 or so odd different plans, is that, especially with those that are very traditional, right? You've got the EDI group, and then you got clinical group. And the two don't even go to lunch together. And they're in the same building. I don't know if that's the case with you all. It was not a question I really wanted you to get answers from, but that was my observation. The point of that is because of the barriers that the plans build up themselves from traditional operational processes and ownership of lines of business and groups and departments and all that, maybe part of the reason for the 8%, right? And some of the challenges I see is internal. It's not even the technology. It's just that we come about it from a very different perspective within the plans themselves. Does that make sense to anybody but the voice in my head on the first table? You good? Okay, absolutely is good. I'm absolutely good. I like it.
All right, so let me talk the last slide on the solution. So in essence, if you were to support both regulations, you would need to have some kind of a FHIR gateway. You would need to have your traditional EDI gateway. And on the back end of the solution, of course, you need to have the transactional store where, all the interactions, everything that you exchange with the provider needs to be stored for audit purposes. Not only your X12 transactions, but mind you, even what we call FHIR interactions. So if there was a CDS hook request and you replied something with it, you have to store that, that this actually interaction happened. Because later on, if somebody questions and so on, you should be able to answer, why did I do that? Why wasn't I able to answer? Or why did I answer that way the way I answered? But more importantly is, even if, as transactions flow through, they carry clinical information. They carry information about the member. That information, you ought to store it in some central, what I was talking about, some central clinical store, where the attachments would go, where clinical information would go, so that you can actually reuse that information, both internally for your internal purposes, as well as, when you ask this information from the provider, don't ask the same information again and again. You have it, you already got it as part of some process, use it. So that's kind of what I wanted to convey with this slide.
Add one bit of information. One of the things don't forget and keep in mind, right, is that if we gain this information, it's under our control and we're maintaining it. That's a very specific language I'm using, right? Is because then it falls under the guise of the original patient access API rules, which means as I gain and control this clinical information for other business reasons, I then by law are required to expose that to our members, right, via the patient access API. So there has to be something that also needs to be considered. Now with the burden reduction rule, we're expanding that, of course, now talking about any electronic prior authorization. Any. I mean, number of plans that I tried to explain it to them, and I asked them, I said, where are you getting them from? They listen to that out. And I go, well, which ones are to you or would fall under that definition? And they'll exclude certain things. Like, no, that proprietary API that you've done with this provider portal that's doing a proprietary API for prior authorization hit against your utilization management system falls under the guide. You now need to capture that and put that in. It's more from yesterday's call. Yeah, go ahead. Please. So, oh, you want to do it? Or you want to do it? Okay. So the question to repeat it for everybody, right? He's asking, he said, hey, under the data storage column, I'll do my Tom Brady Hertz commercial. Who hasn't seen that? So up in here, he's asking, is that only attachments and only clinical? What about claims, right? Data. And the answer is yes. It's all of that. It's all the above. Really, the way this should be viewed, for me personally, is it's your patient longitudinal record. That's really what this is. Your patient longitudinal record, which includes claims and things like that. Okay? It would cover all of that. So good question. I love the question. So the question was, is this a generic data model? What's the data model like this look like? Or is it specific or not? That's for you to determine, right? So within the FHIR community, we're working on those, right? And those are what the resource definitions look like. So I can do a get patient $ everything. And it's like, that's what the model looks like, right? It's a consolidation of all these resource definitions. That's the proposal. US Core and US CDI does a good job of defining the types of data sets, but they don't give us any specificity behind structures, right? And that now you get into, all right, well, now you've got X12 and doing that, but you also now you got Da Vinci doing it. And you know, in the FHIR organization that we're participating in, very prescriptive on what those data sets structures look like. Now, how do you store it? We had a conversation yesterday. Someone talked about, it was ARPIT. Talk about like a facade base versus a FHIR repository, right? You know, at the end of the day, you need to persist that data in somewhere, and it's a business by business decision on how architecturally to do that. The important thing we want to try to strive is to say you do need that in a place, and you do need that interoperable between your own systems. That's my point. The lack of interoperability between planned systems is also part of, I think, an issue, to be candid. Okay. Hopefully that answers your question. Was there? Yeah. Oh, wait, yep. So I'm going to try to repeat it, and I will screw this up. Just guarantee that, right? I'm not going to blame it on the hangover. I'll just say it's my bad ears, right? And they're plenty big, so I should be able to hear everything. There you go. Come on. Can you repeat the question for everybody so then everyone will hear the same thing I did again?
Sure. And you kind of mentioned that your internal interoperability is a aspect.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking, and we are in the middle of some transformation like this, so that's why my question is very personal here. So, when we put clinical data together with claims data, how can I organize it in a generic structure that is interoperable, not just internally, but also externally for wider consumption?
Yeah, so I will.
Like
I'm a bit of a bigot here, and I think Mark is too. Our answer would be what, right, Mark? Yeah, follow the US, follow the FHIR specification, the resource definition. That is, to me, is the canonical form for capturing US core, because it has to follow the US core. So the feds will push the EMRs to go US core based and have those same sets of elements by just adopting and using the FHIR specifications as your canonical schemas. Then you're going to be core compliant, and you'll be automatically interoperability externally. You'll follow all those regulations, and if you had a better chance to be candid with you, of interoperability internally. That make sense? Does that sound fair? Any follow-up questions or comments to that? Great question. Yeah, Mark.
Like you say, we're pretty bigoted on this one. One of the things in the Prior Auth rule is they're actually saying, they've made FHIR R4 standard. They're pointing at the various implementation guides, including Blue Button, US Core, Formulary, etc. They're also with the payer-to-payer API and the provider access API saying you're going to take that same core data that you need to make available to your members, and you need to now make it available to these other audiences. So they're clearly saying, we need to be investing in FHIR. And then you can look at whether you actually use those FHIR specifications for your internal interoperability. Because if you've already built it, can you reuse it and just make it available to a different internal audience?
So I will add this, right? Where are we going with this? Interoperability is a neat term, but it also means what? And I think this was mentioned a little bit yesterday, might have been this morning, but more yesterday. It becomes into a data security. If we're making it open, we're sharing this PHI, let's be candid, right? It's with other payers, right? Without financial information in the claims, right? With the providers, am I doing it to the right providers? I got state regulations going all over the place with what can be shared. Now you're getting into, all right, interoperability comes with a cost. Now we have to think about consent control. And I mean from a digital perspective and not a manual process perspective, which is still the predominant means most plans do that, right? If I'm a authorized user, right, versus I'm a legal guardian. I can act as that member. I can get to that data. So interoperability does come at a cost. There are regulations around it. I wholeheartedly believe it is the future where we're going to go with all this stuff. It's a matter of when, right? Personally speaking, I think the 0057 is the litmus test in the industry that the feds, whether they're intentionally doing this or not, are putting on the industry on what's the pulse. What's the acceptance of moving in a glide path fashion more toward FHIR-based, to be perfectly candid, right? So because of that, you're seeing the X12 and you're seeing the FHIR specifications having these paths, and now they're starting to cross, right? Through regulation. That's why we get letters like last week when there are conflicts and interpretation and confusion, right? It's going to grow personal belief. I'm sorry, I'm taking away from my sales. I'm in my product guide.
Actually, I'm kind of done here with the solution. So, in the conclusion, I kept saying, throughout this, the holistic view of the patient. This should be where you're looking at. This should be why you're waking up and solving this problem. Look at the patient and the patient needs, and then everything else, of course, will fall into place if that is your priority. And in terms of the implementation, of course, we like to say, it's assess, engage, test, and monitor. Right? You have to assess what your capabilities of your trading partners, your providers, clearing houses, in order to make this happen. Then engage with your partners, providers, clearing houses to make this happen. Test, and then of course monitor how things are going. So that's kind of my parting words. Kevin, if you want to add.
The last thing I'll only add is just from an individual perspective. So of course I represent Edifecs, but title is principal business advisor for a reason, right? So feel free to reach out to me directly, or talk to me after this. I'm actually running out the door pretty much, but happy to have any discussion if you have any kind of follow-up questions. Anybody in the room, just about regulations, experience, thoughts, is a sounding board, whatever. Happy to take any call you all have, and be non-salesy, I promise. Other than that, hopefully this was educational and maybe a little entertaining. I don't know. I get bored easily. Maybe it's my ADHD. At 58, I still have it. I don't know. But thanks, everybody. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin Day and Sergio Rata with Edifecs.